Crisis in the late medieval church. The late medieval church was caught in a serious, long-standing political crisis, having to do mainly with the relation between church and state, such as the state existed in the Middle Ages. The Concordat of Worms of 1122 separated, in theory at least, the sacred and secular dimensions of ecclesiastical office. However, political conflicts continued. Papal elections were often contested by rival factions within the College of Cardinals, each faction supported by powerful secular rulers or outside lay groups. Often the rival groups would elect an anti-pope, that is, a false claimant, to the papal office. There were also conflicts between the pope and secular rulers. A person who personifies this conflict and ambiguity of church-state relations in the Middle Ages is Emperor Frederick II. Frederick was emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He was well educated and supported higher education, founding the University of Naples in 1224. He authored a book on the art of falconry, and he was also committed to the teaching of the church and enforced Catholic orthodoxy throughout the empire. So one would think that Frederick was the ideal Christian ruler, and he was referred to by the people of his day as Stupor Mundi, that is, wonder of the world. Frederick's relationship with the church, however, was fraught with controversy, stemming primarily from his involvement in the Crusades. He had made an early vow to undertake a crusade to the Holy Land, but kept delaying the fulfillment of this vow, for which Pope Gregory IX, in exasperation, excommunicated him. In 1227, Frederick finally went on his promised crusade. It was so successful that he managed, through diplomacy rather than fighting, to have Jerusalem returned to Christian control from the Muslims. Upon entering the Holy City, however, Frederick had himself crowned King of Jerusalem without the approval of the Pope. Not only was it a problem for him to do so without the Pope's approval, it was inherently problematic. Godfrey of Bouillon, who had headed the First Crusade in 1099, when he took Jerusalem, assumed the much more modest title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, a reference to the tomb of the resurrected Christ. Godfrey did this because Jerusalem already had a king, Christ himself. So Frederick's proud action arguably set him in opposition both to the Pope and by implication to Christ. War then erupted between the emperor and the Pope, with Gregory even referring to Frederick as the Antichrist. We turn our attention now to France. France became the new protector of the papacy in the wake of Frederick II, who actually died reconciled to the Church. Eventually, a majority of the cardinals were French, and in 1305 they elected a Frenchman, Pope Clement V. Clement then relocated the papal court to Avignon, France. The rationale for this was to get the papacy away from the domineering influence of the Holy Roman Emperor on the one hand and the various Roman factions on the other. The papal court remained here until 1377. Now, we might suspect that the popes of the Avignon papacy wouldn't be the best popes, seeing how the papacy, the papal court, is now located not in Rome, its proper place, but in a foreign city, Avignon, in France. And indeed, John the 22nd, who reigned from 1316 to 1334, kind of fits that description. He was perhaps the most controversial of Avignon popes. We see this in his conflict, first of all, in his conflict with the Emperor Louis IV of Bavaria. It began as a dispute between Louis and Frederick of Austria. John admonished them to settle the matter amicably, but Louis defeated Frederick and became emperor. Louis then invaded Italy, had himself crowned King of Italy in Milan, and threw his support behind one Galeazzo Visconti, ruler of Milan and political enemy of Pope John. John nullified the imperial election, asserting his legal prerogative to approve the election of the emperor. Louis formally denied the papal claim, and John then excommunicated Louis. Louis then declared John deposed on the charge of heresy and appointed an anti-pope, Nicholas V. After Louis returned to Germany, Nicholas submitted to John, so the crisis just sort of faded away. But in another matter, in a more theological matter, John entered into a conflict with the Franciscan order about the proper interpretation of the rule of Francis in regard to evangelical poverty. Now, by this time, the Franciscan order was divided into two groups, the conventuals and the spirituals. The conventuals held to a broader interpretation of the rule of Francis. The friars could live in houses, that is, convents, hence the name conventual, and use property, provided the property was owned by the papacy. The spiritual, however, maintained a strict interpretation of the Franciscan rule. In their view, the friars could neither own nor even use property. John took action against the spirituals, imprisoning their delegates when they came to present their case to him in Avignon. He handed over 25 spirituals to the Inquisition, 4 of whom were burned at the stake. And he condemned the doctrine of evangelical poverty and declared it heresy to maintain that Christ and the apostles had owned no property. Interestingly, John himself came under a charge of heresy. Pope John asserted that the souls of the faithful departed do not experience the beatific vision until the general resurrection. The theology faculty at the University of Paris declared this view heretical, and hence Lewis's earlier charge of heresy in his conflict with the Pope. Now we come to Benedict XII, who reigned from 1334 to 1342. Benedict was a Cistercian monk, a scholar, and issued the bull Benedictus Deus, asserting, contrary to John the 22nd, that the souls of the departed experienced the beatific vision immediately after death. He was also a religious reformer and reformed the laxity of the Cistercians, Franciscans, and Benedictines. He compelled them to observe stricter discipline, prescribed the regular holding of chapters for the orders, mandated monastery visitation, and required young religious to attend universities. He was also an inquisitor. He had his hand in the papal inquisition of heresy. He is known to be thorough yet merciful. Clement VI, who reigned from 1342 to 1352, was known for his generosity, particularly in regard to the Jews of Avignon. He offered them sanctuary when they were blamed for the Black Death, which was ravaging Europe in that time, 1348 to 1349. Now we come to Innocent VI, who reigned from 1352 to 1362. He was known primarily as a reformer of the papal curia and a patron of letters. Next we come to Urban V, who reigned from 1362 to 1370. He was a Benedictine monk, very devout in his faith. He supported impoverished students, founded universities, launched an unsuccessful crusade, and in 1367 he landed in Italy, and it seemed as though the papacy would stay in Rome. Urban nevertheless returned to France, where he died in 1370. Urban was succeeded by Pope Gregory XI, who reigned from 1370 to 1378, and he is known primarily for returning the papal court to Rome. In 1378, Gregory died. Urban VI was elected as his successor. He was elected by French cardinals, and it looked as though the French hold on the papacy would remain in place. Now, Urban VI had been part of the papal court at Avignon. He was an Italian, but had a French outlook on church governance. He was less autocratic and maintained that the Pope, while the supreme head of the church, governs in consultation with the cardinals. Urban, however, took steps to reassert a more monarchical view of the papacy. He began appointing Italian cardinals as a way of undermining the French cardinals. The French cardinals, as you might expect, did not like this one bit, and they responded by meeting in a new conclave of their own and declared Urban's election null. They then elected an anti-pope, Clement VII, and moved back to Avignon. Now there were two courts claiming to be the legitimate papacy, one in Rome, one in Avignon. The one in Rome was ruled by, in succession, Urban VI, Boniface IX, and Gregory XII. The one in Avignon was ruled in succession by two anti-popes, Clement VII and Benedict XIII. Various European kingdoms and monarchs supported the rival courts, each claimant excommunicating the followers of his rival. And this went on for about 70 years, in which Christians in Europe, at least in Western Europe, were not quite sure who the true pope was. Now, in order to heal the schism, a church council, the Council of Pisa, was convened in 1409. It was called by cardinals of both parties, and there the participants elected Alexander V as a new pope. Neither Gregory in Rome nor Benedict in Avignon, however, would recognize the election. So now there were three claimants to the papacy, one in Rome, one in Avignon, and one in Pisa. 5 years later, anti-pope John XXIII convened a council at Constance, which sat from 1414 to 1417. The council then deposed John as pope. Gregory, then the true pope in Rome, formally convened the council, granting it legitimacy. Gregory then resigned, and the council fathers then elected one Martin V as the new pope. Thus the schism ended. But again, it was a schism that lasted some 70 years. The schism was healed, yet Christians became cynical of church leadership. And it was an object lesson on the church getting enmeshed in temporal power, and set the stage for the church reform, so-called, of the Protestant Reformation, which would result in open schism from the Catholic Church and the establishment of Protestant churches firmly under state control.